Hello, and welcome to our talk on food and agriculture during the Civil War. This event is part of the 28th Annual Civil War on the Border series. The theme for this year's events is food insecurity, past and present. So on that theme, we're very excited to welcome R. Douglas Hurt, professor of history at Purdue University. Dr. Hurt earned his PhD just down the road from us at Kansas State University. Among his many books are Agriculture in the Confederacy and Food and Agriculture During the Civil War, which I have here. And as you can see, I got them through interlibrary loan from our fantastic Lawrence Public Library. Dr. Hurt, thank you for joining us today.
Dr. Haynes, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
We are too. I'd like to just jump right into it. Historians and the public who are fascinated or knowledgeable about the Civil War, know that agriculture was very important in that era. But for most of us, our knowledge doesn't go very far beyond that point. So just how crucial was agriculture to economics and society in America on the eve of the Civil War?
Oh, considerable. Probably at least 75% of the economy is agriculturally driven in 1860. You have about 31 million population, a little bit more perhaps. The southern population is a little over 9 million. And most of these people had a rural background if they weren't farmers at that moment. But by and large, it's the primary driving force of the economy, both north and south.
Great. So actually on that topic, I have a more specific question. This is something I've always wondered studying the Civil War. Is it possible to estimate how many Americans got their food from their own production, like on their farms, as opposed to buying it?
Well, it'd be just a rough calculation, since the U.S. Census Bureau wasn't really precise on many of its numbers in 1859, when the 1860 census is basically founded on. But in 1860, roughly about 53% of the population is involved in agriculture. So if you do 53% of 31 million, you're looking at essentially 16 or 17 million people that are actually on the farm. Now, most of these people would have been producing for their own consumption, safety first agriculture. Not everybody could do everything. And so there's still going to be farmers relying upon the corner trader, grocery store for some kind of produce or food. Just as an example, dairy products are really very difficult to buy in the South in 1860. Butter, for example, is largely shipped from New England by the sea, and even though the quality wasn't necessarily very good, it was by and large better than the dairying product in South Carolina, for example. So depending on where you were, you as a farmer, you still needed to buy other things. But for the most part, in 1860, most farm families were practicing a safety first agriculture and participating in the commercial market economy selectively, depending upon their climate and soils and the product that would have some kind of attraction to consumers. So there's a little bit of a mix. You'll find farmers, farm families relying more upon grocery stores, we can call them that, in the 1870s and 1880s. But in the late 50s and on the eve of the Civil War, they would still have been purchasing some goods. Unless you're in California, you're not going to have oranges in your backyard. So, although that sounds sort of facetious, it gives an idea that certain commodities, if you wanted them and could afford them, you would simply have to buy them.
Yeah. Now, that's an interesting term, safety first agriculture. Is that the same thing as subsistence?
No, it's not. It's not.
Oh,
Nobody is really a subsistence.
mm,
Farmers, farm families from the very beginning could never really produce everything that they needed, but so they had to buy something or acquire it in some fashion through trade. But a safety first agriculture basically means that you provided the essentials for your family, whether it's beef or pork or eggs or cornmeal. You had enough to provide for the basic caloric intake that you needed to sustain life. And then you participated in the market economy in some fashion if you had access to one. But so there's a slight difference here. But this farmers really are not really subsistence in a standalone fashion. They're not 100% on their own at any time.
I see. All right, that's interesting. So, in both of these great books, you highlight this concept of agriculture as power, which I was pretty interested to read about, and how it factored into the war. So, in 1861, when the war began, how did the United States and the Confederacy both expect to leverage agriculture, or both think that agriculture would help them win the war? And of course, a follow up question would be, did agriculture provide the kind of power that each side was expecting or hoping that it would?
And this is a term that it's not original by me, but simply by reading the newspapers at this time, the agricultural editors North and South both used this term power. And I thought that was very interesting myself. Southerners believed that they really had the agricultural productivity that would feed an army and feed the population. And since their generals clearly in the beginning at least were superior to the Union leadership, it seemed like these were the two essentials that would ensure their independence. And they welcomed it. One of the things that they particularly talked about was that the break from the Union would increase diversification among Southern farmers and planters, and that would be good for the region, kind of wean it from agricultural trade with the North. Union or Northern agricultural editors also use this term. And they could see, as many of their readers did not early on, that in time of war, armies buy everything, and the price really doesn't matter. And the assumption is that historically, agricultural prices increased during wartime, and this would be an opportunity for Northern farmers to really make some money. And it doesn't occur quickly, but they were right on target. It's going to take some adjustment before Northern agricultural prices increase, and really they don't jump significantly until about December of 1861, but they escalate thereafter. And the advantage of Northern farmers is that unless the enemy is marching through your barnyard and stealing your livestock and burning your house, or unless you lose your life, it's really a good time, wartime for farmers. But if the opposite is true, as turned out to be the case in the South, then the outcome is very different. But the war years were very good years, economically speaking, for Northern farmers. And that power, economic power of production and being able to support the military and the civilian population at the same time grows and increases. And there's really not a problem of food shortage in the North. Southerners find that, probably also by late 1861, maybe November, December, that maybe they'd miscalculated, that food prices were increasing, but not necessarily advantageously to many farmers because the Confederate currency was already beginning to depreciate, and within the next year it depreciates very rapidly, and so there's not much opportunity for income improvement on the part of those farmers. But in the beginning, both regions, particularly as voiced by the agricultural editors, really talked about strength and power of agriculture supporting the military. And the Southerners believed if you have a strong army and a strong agriculture, you couldn't lose. And they weren't particularly apprehensive about the outcome. Northern farmers, it took some readjustment in terms of market flow and transmission and transport of commodities before they began to see the significance of wartime on agricultural prices. But it comes, and it comes by late 1861.
Mm. So I think you partly answered my next question already, and it's interesting to hear how the North was able to actually keep this power of agriculture going throughout the war. Because I'm curious about, millions of men on both sides went off to war, over time. By the end, it had been millions. It wasn't millions all at once, of course. But how did this, of course, many of those men came from farm families or were laborers on farms. So how did this impact productivity in society, if it did?
Well, negatively for Southerners, the conscription rate was very high. You'll find that the slave labor population, depending on proximity to northern forces, became less productive. If a planter or farmer, and we have to remember that 3/4 of the farmers in the South did not own slaves, but those that relied upon slave labor for their agricultural needs often found that if they were close to union lines, that labor tended to disappear. There's also a clear indication that slave population knew what was going on and could see or at least hope that the end was in sight for this kind of an institution and bondage, and clearly their efforts to bring in a crop were less than enthusiastic, as we can well imagine. So the productivity of the labor force in that context certainly declines. Now, you also see white women on poor farms, on small farms, working in the fields, and that wasn't necessarily unusual. It is, however, unusual in the North, and people commented on it first. But two things happen in the North that don't happen in the South. One is, given the very rapid increase in agricultural prices, Northern families, even though they had, husbands, sons, brothers in the military and were gone, had disposable income. And they often spent this money on agricultural equipment. And the agricultural equipment companies during the course of the Civil War in the North really were quite profitable. And they were turning out all sorts of self-rake reapers and cultivators and plows and the kinds of things that could ease somebody's labor, and they were able to afford it. So mechanization really replaced a considerable amount of human labor in the North during the course of the war. Now, that doesn't increase productivity per acre, but it increases the amount of, or the number of acres you can cultivate, which then increases production. And we see that uniformly across the North. The second thing that's interesting about productivity in agricultural labor is that we see a real change in the gender division of labor in agriculture in the North. And that is more and more women are working in the fields. The general division by this time basically was women were responsible for the barnyard, poultry, eggs, milking some cows, making butter, which you could sell at a local market. But they didn't do field work. But you see, as early as 1861, and certainly by the end of 1864, increasingly women working in the fields, driving a reaper, riding a hay rake, women raking cut grain, wheat, and putting in bundles. And at first it was very unusual, and people would comment on it. But by 1864, it was almost expected that you would see women working in the field. So not all women did by any means, but enough of the female population on the farms did go into the fields that it made a difference. And so with the combination of sort of a substitute labor force for heavy work, as well as increased mechanization, because these families could afford it, there's a very different productivity flow than you have in the South.
Very interesting. So, sort of related to this topic, in fact, very related to it, I'd like to talk about a different or another population that's also working. How did enslaved people and freedmen affect agriculture during the war?
Well, in terms of those bonded men and women, there's a tendency to do less work, particularly if you thought that your freedom was close. The matter of freed men and women is an interesting and complex one. Probably as early as 1863, when Union forces are really in control of the Sea Islands off the Carolinas, and making considerable gains in the Mississippi Delta. These large plantation areas for rice and cotton, particularly, that are overrun by Union forces, with a large slave population, are under the control either of the Department of War or the Department of the Treasury. The difficulty here was that once the Union forces moved into Confederate territory and occupied it, black men and women, the slave population, they were essentially free. Not legally, but they weren't going back, and nobody's going to send them back, so they were free. So the question is, what do you do with tens of thousands of people that now maybe have no place to go? The Army had tried to develop some rules and regulations, particularly in the Mississippi Delta, whereby the planters, if they still retain their property, could hire their workforce back for a daily wage. And this didn't particularly work out very well, because the planters didn't have any money, any greenbacks that they could pay people with, and their credit was particularly gone. So by 63, what you see happening, largely because of military policy in the Delta, is that slaves are given the opportunity, not required, but given the opportunity, although they didn't really have much of an opportunity anyway. They had no place to go. They had to do something. The United States government didn't want to feed them. That was going to be costly. So the scheme has worked out that if they return to the plantations, the planters would give them some property, and they could raise cotton, and they would be paid with a portion of the crop. Well, here you have the generation, the foundation of the sharecropping system that's going to be really the Achilles heel of poverty in the South until probably the Second World War. So it's going to have a long-term effect. But the freed men and women that become involved in this sharecropping system, because they had to do something and they had no place to go, become they're free, but the regulations for their lifestyle are almost like the black codes of the antebellum period. They're free basically in name only, pretty close to peonage. But this is a very substantial change in the agricultural labor system that's going to be a plague on Southern agriculture for decades to come. But it begins about 1863, and you see it really developing as a major agricultural labor institution, sharecropping, now in the late 60s, 1870s, and certainly by the 1880s, it's well established.
Hmm. And this reminded me, am I correct that it was Jefferson Davis's plantation where the Union implemented this system during one of the places where they implemented?
Well, one of the places, yeah,
yeah,
the sort of retribution. I'm sure some people felt very good about it. Davis wasn't particularly enamored with it, but yeah. The large planters really had no choice. Now, many of them departed, left, and their lands were confiscated and either rented or sold to somebody else, often Northerners. But the planters that held on, hoping that they would have some kind of a reprieve, which President Johnson gave them very quickly, return their lands to them, had to take a loyalty oath, and basically that was about it. So many of the planters remained in place, and they returned to cotton production. But given the absence of a mechanical cotton picker, you needed, which is the bottleneck for cotton production, you needed a large labor force, and the labor force was there, but now it was free. But sharecropping becomes a mechanism to capitalize on that labor force very cheaply, but also in ways that really differ very little from the days of slavery, with all sorts of regulations on plantations about when you worked and what days you had off and what your pay was and all sorts of penalties, very much like the black codes of the antebellum period.
Right. Well, going backward to the war years again, a theme that you include in both of these books that we're talking about tonight is trading between the lines, particularly for cotton. And this has always sort of mildly shocked me when I read about it happening during the war. So I'm curious, like, who allowed this and what to happen, and why was it allowed to happen?
The Union operated on the principle that commerce followed the flag. So if Union forces captured a particular area, occupied a particular area, then it was free for both those Confederates and Northerners to trade with each other. Lincoln was very supportive of this. He believed that if Northerners could trade with Southern farmers and vice versa, that you might not convince Southerners to be loyal, but you could probably convince them to be neutral because they wanted Northern money. And that's the key to all of this. If a Southern farmer had a bale or two of cotton and was close to Union lines and could pass through and sell that cotton, that was to his advantage. The catch was, according to Union policy, that if a Confederate sold agricultural goods across Union lines, they had to accept Union dollars, that is, greenbacks. This was sort of problematic because if you go back through the lines into Confederate territory and you've got a lot of Union money, your loyalty certainly can be questioned. There are traders, though, that bought up a considerable amount of cotton in the Memphis area, for example. The wagon hauled it into market and sold it for greenbacks, and then, crafty as they could be, once you got across Union lines again, you could exchange those greenbacks for Confederate dollars, which were really just inflated, and you could buy land very cheaply or something else. The trade also enabled either farmers or merchants involved in this business to exchange cotton, particularly for commodities, goods of various sorts, and then pass through Southern lines in. It could be sold to, your neighbors, meet some of the deficiencies that they had, or even to military forces. So it worked. It worked both ways. I think a real key to this is that the Confederate currency was so depreciated that and farmers had virtually no confidence in it at all, that northern greenbacks were better than Confederate currency that they didn't trust. And if there was any ability at all to get through a Union line, or if your area had been occupied by Union forces, the cash made a difference, because people have to live, and you have a standard of living, and want is something that people certainly chose to avoid if at all possible. But it's really a political a matter as well as an economic matter, and it worked certainly to the Union advantage.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, from the sounds of it. So, you can't really talk about agriculture during the Civil War without talking about the Union blockade of the South. And this was a naval blockade. It was one of, if not Lincoln's, almost one of his very first operations that he put in place in the war. Certainly the very first military campaign that was authorized on the Union side. It was intended, of course, as a blockade is, to cut the South off from trading partners overseas. Historians have long debated the effectiveness of the U.S. blockade of the Confederacy. So I'm curious, what do you think was the real impact of that blockade?
I think you have to look at it in two contexts. The naval blockade of the coast, in Virginia, around the Carolinas, Florida, and around the Gulf Coast is one thing. To say whether it was useful or not would, I think, depend upon whether it was tested, and the British chose not to test it. The Confederacy really believed that that the Union had really shot itself in the foot by making such a dumb decision, because the British textile manufacturers would need cotton, and they would have to come and get it. And if they came to get it, it would probably require the British Navy to protect its merchant ships. And if that happened, the situation was going to be very different. But the British didn't test the blockade in that context, because it needed northern grain more than it needed southern cotton. The 1860 the wheat harvest in Britain had been nearly a failure, and so their demands, their needs for American grain were very high, and the productivity of northern wheat and corn farmers was so great that we were able to make up those deficits without any trouble at all. The wheat that normally was traded out of Virginia, for example, to Great Britain, northern traders made that up. There's just such a particular surplus. The wheat harvest in the North in 1860 and 1861, actually 1859 too, was very large. So the surpluses are there. The granaries are just overflowing, and the federal government made certain that British needs were met, and also in areas where Union forces were able to capture cotton and take it from warehouses and whatnot. The Union made a concerted effort to make sure that cotton was sent to Great Britain. So that's a factor in it as well. The other matter is that the British had a considerable supply of cotton anyway. 1859, 60, it bought a lot, and depending upon which estimate you look at, they considered they could probably last 12 to 18 months before they had to make a decision on how they were going to get more cotton. And so this is something that delays things a bit and affects the blockade. But I would say that the policy of the federal government to provide the bread needs of the British is considerable. And the British, I think, made a calculated decision that it was better that working class people be fed rather than have the factories operate. And so they juggled these two balls and made that decision. The other aspect of this, though, has to deal with the Mississippi River. And when the blockade was announced, the Southerners thought this was just great news. The military cut the Mississippi River at Cairo, and they blockaded the Missouri River at Leavenworth, Kansas. So nothing was going to come down either of those rivers on the way to this major market entrepot of New Orleans. And but Southerners thought, well, this is fine because it's going to force Southern farmers to diversify, and that's going to be good for the economy. Secondly, they thought, these Northern farmers are going to be so greedy and fighting among themselves that it'll become a political problem in the North, and Congress will be up in arms about the block of trade and the lack of economic gain, particularly in the Northwest, but also that much of the produce would have to go to feed the New England cities and Philadelphia, New York, and that sort of thing. So it would just be a wonderful opportunity for Southerners to become more independent. And for a while, this actually looked like that might happen. And Midwestern farmers, Iowans and Illinois, and people that had access to waterways that plugged into the Mississippi River previously found that everything was just blocked up. And this is one of the reasons that the price increases did not occur until late 1861. It took a considerable amount of time for shippers to get their grain from rivers to railroad sidings to transport it to mills wherever it was needed. And it takes almost the rest of 1861 before the railroads and shippers are able to get away from the Mississippi River particularly, and begin transporting grain and livestock eastward by rail to packing houses like Chicago and farther east or into milling facilities. But once that happens, then the price of grain starts to go up, and it's clear that the hopes of the Southerners simply were not going to materialize. But again, it takes a while.
Right. Well, you on this topic. So you already mentioned that Northerners didn't really suffer from food scarcities during the war years. But how did food scarcity weaken the Confederacy and contribute to its defeat, if it did?
Well, it did in several contexts. One is that armies in the field really require a considerable amount of calories to function. And as food supplies dwindled, particularly where armies marched, the livestock, meat, and cornmeal, particularly very basic, fundamental, supplement kinds of food, certainly diminish. The railroad system in the South is much less in terms of mileage than in the North. And often the lines ran the wrong way. And so it was difficult to get commodities shipped where you wanted them to go and quickly. The railroads were really essentially taken over by the military. And so the shipment of commodities to the cities, Richmond, for example, or Charleston, or wherever, proved very difficult in terms of scheduling. But where armies marched, productivity really declined. And this is becoming particularly evident to a very serious extent by 1862. And it gets worse thereafter. So productivity declines in many respects. the currency is valueless, and so it's depreciated so much that inflation is just enormous. And often farmers chose not to sell their commodities if they didn't have to, waiting for some change of policy that would benefit them. The other thing is that given this situation, the Confederacy, the Army, pursued a policy of impressment. Since farmers, in their judgment, in many respects, weren't producing enough or selling enough, and traders weren't shipping enough, the Army particularly confiscated food and forage. And although the Confederacy set a price schedule for what they took, and either paid for it in Confederate currency or with notes, promises to pay, farmers just hated it. And by 63, you find some farmers in these contested areas actually hiding grain and hay and all sorts of things, horses, for example, that could be scooped up, and that's not helpful at all. So that's a negative effect of sort of the decline of agriculture in that respect. The productivity, though, is spotty, where you don't have military conflicts. Farmers, were essentially untouched, but often what they raised couldn't be transported and processed to get to the right people. And so you find that the urban population, as well as the military population, really starts to feel the twang of, at least in the cities, of very expensive foods and often not much of it. And part of the countryside, farmers find that it's being taken, or they're being paid at government prices that are not free market prices, and they feel cheated. So overall, what happens essentially is that there's really a psychological burden that develops in all of this. Now, farmers increasingly, maybe they support the cause, but they don't necessarily support government policy. And this has a wearing effect. So 63 and 64, and certainly by the early 1865, when essentially the war was over, farm men and women really are pretty demoralized, and just want things to be over. And if you could preserve the Union and maintain the institution of slavery, that would be just great. But if not, they really believe that their economic situation was going to be very terrible for a long time.
Well, that takes us to right up to the just about the end of the war. So I'd like to just end things today by asking Dr. Hurt, what projects are you working on right now? You're quite a prolific scholar, so I'm curious to see what else you're working on.
Well, actually, I'm doing some work on agriculture during the American Revolution, so that's my big project at the moment.
That sounds really fascinating. You'll have to let me know when that.
Yeah, it's a fun project. I enjoy it.
Yeah. Have there been many books written about agriculture during the Revolution?
None. The literature is sporadic, and usually it has to deal with something else, like some economic aspect of with a line or two dropped in about agriculture and farming. So there isn't a book on it, and the article literature is very sparse and sort of desperate. So I'm bringing sort of things together as a synthesis, but also doing my own research to flesh things out. So that's what I'm occupied with at the moment, and it's fun.
Well, that sounds like it's going to keep you occupied. Certainly,
Yes.
That's such a fruitful field, one that hasn't been explored hardly at all.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Hurt, this has been an excellent conversation. So thank you for lending us your time and expertise today.
Thank you for the invitation. It's been my pleasure.
Ours too. And I highly encourage everyone to check out the two books we discussed today, or at least inspired our discussion, Agriculture in the Confederacy and Food and Agriculture During the Civil War, both by Dr. Hurt. So thank you again, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. So with that, I will say bye for now.